It happened a few years back when I was 16, a sophomore in high school. It felt like just another Friday night in November in my quiet neighborhood in Indiana. I live near the edge of the countryside, with a dense forest and, further on, a field across from my house. I should mention that there weren't many houses around, and most of my friends didn't live nearby. On my left was an elderly couple who usually had family over on weekends, but that night their house was quiet. To my right, there was a middle-aged couple, but they were away working their usual night shifts. Finally, across and far down to the left of my house was a friendly couple with a sweet 5-year-old who always loved to come over and play with me and my 10-year-old brother. My parents decided to go out for the evening, and they usually stayed out late into the night when they did. My brother was spending the night at a friend's house. I felt tired that evening, so I decided to stay home and enjoy a relaxing night while snow started to fall. The night was mostly uneventful, filled with some TV early on and then some Xbox later. I remember having some pasta and chicken, but I should note that I didn't drink or take any substances that night, so I knew what happened next was real. The clock had just struck 11 p.m. when I was deep into a game of Halo, and I suddenly felt that something was off. I brushed it off, thinking it was just that weird feeling you get when you're alone. But just as I started to forget about it, I heard it. Smack, smack, smack. Fear gripped me as I realized that sound wasn't coming from me or the TV. It was louder and clearer than anything that could have come from the game. I turned pale as I realized it came from the window right above the couch. And me. I quickly turned around and lifted the blinds to see no one. Nothing unusual. The snow was falling, and everything looked disturbingly normal. Oh, I thought, maybe it was just rocks blown by the wind, or maybe snow or ice falling from the roof. Despite trying to reassure myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong and that whatever hit that window wasn't an accident. I decided to calm my nerves by heading into the office to play games or watch something on the computer, anything to take my mind off it. For about 30 minutes, it worked. I told myself I was just being silly and should enjoy the time alone. Then, about 35 minutes later, there came another sound. Womp, womp, womp. This time it came from the window to my right in the office. I felt sick. I knew then that this wasn't just a coincidence, and it wasn't the weather or an animal. It was too consistent, too deliberate. I immediately ran to the kitchen and grabbed the family flashlight and a large knife. One for checking things out, the other for defense if my gut feeling was right. I ran back and shined the flashlight out the window into the yard and the forest. I didn't see anything, except what looked like light footprints leading from the window to the forest in the thin layer of snow on the ground. My mind raced with possibilities. I had never felt this much fear in my life. I called my mom, hoping she would answer. When I finally reached her, I told her what had happened. She spoke in a hopeful yet serious tone. "Lock the doors. If it happens again, call the police. Stay safe." My parents were about an hour away, and they offered to come home, but I refused, not wanting to ruin their night. I went to each door and locked them to each window, and then up to my room with my phone, the knife, and the flashlight. I still didn't fully believe it could be real, so I put on some music and tried to fall asleep, hoping to wake up and realize it was all just my imagination. I was listening to music and nearly asleep when I thought I heard something in the completely quiet house. I took my earbuds out to hear a new sound. Whack, whack, whack. With each hit, my heart sank more. After a few moments, it stopped, but I was too scared to move from my bed. I called my parents again. Within 45 minutes, they were home, and thankfully, there were no further incidents. By then, it was around 3 a.m. I told them everything I could remember and showed them what I had seen. The three of us searched the outside of the house, with my dad carrying his handgun in case we found anything. Once again, nothing was found, except for deep footprints in the now several inches of snow. These prints circled the house several times, stopping in front of the windows and the side door, which, upon closer inspection, had a dent in the center, as if something heavy had hit it. We stayed up until morning, and then my dad decided to follow the tracks into the forest to see where they led. When he came back, he told us that the tracks led to a small shelter where he found several photographs of our house and a small sledgehammer with splinters stuck on it. The tracks then led to a road far across the field. After that night, I didn't stay in the house alone at night for years. This story happened when I was 21 years old. I had just returned home from a late shift stocking shelves at the nearby supermarket. I usually got off work around midnight since I worked the closing shift. I lived in a low-budget apartment with my roommate, Steve. We didn't live in the best neighborhood, but I was just grateful to have a place of my own instead of crashing at my parents' house. I tossed my jacket on the hook near the front door and headed to the kitchen to search for a snack. I had just grabbed a frozen pizza from the freezer when I noticed something odd. My bedroom door was slightly ajar as I walked past the hallway. This might not seem strange at first, but I distinctly remembered closing it that morning before heading to work. I value my privacy, so I always make sure to shut my door when I leave. I stepped back into the living room and glanced down the hall. "Hello," I called out. There was only silence. Not wanting to let my nerves get to me, I walked across the living room and flicked on the hallway light switch. "Steve, is that you?" I asked. Steve was always a bit quirky, so I figured maybe he was trying to pull some kind of prank on me. Maybe he was waiting to jump out of my closet when I entered my room. When I reached the bedroom door, I slowly pushed it open. The light from the hallway spilled into the room, lighting up a good portion of it. I looked around, definitely feeling uneasy. The room was empty, and everything seemed normal. Just my usual stuff, my twin bed with a nightstand on the left. I shut the door and went back to the kitchen. I put my dinner in the microwave and hit the start button. While it was heating up, I turned on the TV, ready to put on a scary movie and unwind. Suddenly, I heard a dull thud coming from down the hall. At first, I thought it was just the neighbors. They could be pretty noisy, and it wasn't uncommon to hear a loud bang at night. But then it happened again, and this time I was sure it was coming from down the hall. "Steve," I called out again. Just then, the microwave beeped, making me jump. "Yeah, sorry. I dropped something," I heard him say through the door. I'll admit, I felt a bit relieved knowing Steve was home. I walked back to the kitchen to grab my food, and that's when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Steve. "Hey man, I'm running late at work. Could you leave the door unlocked for me?" My heart sank, and a chill shot down my spine. I texted back, "Wait, you're still at work?" He replied a few seconds later, "Yeah, why?" At that moment, another sound came from the hallway, and I looked up. The silhouette of a tall man was standing there, holding what looked like a large knife. I bolted for the front door, hearing the heavy thud of the man's boots behind me. He wasn't running, more like he was walking slowly, deliberately. I didn't look back. I sprinted down the emergency stairs and out into the parking lot where I called the police. I was 13. It was a typical evening, around 8:30 p.m. My younger cousin and I were at his place because I was babysitting while my mom and aunt were out shopping, and my dad and uncle were at a movie. We were just sitting there, and I started to feel really uneasy. Something felt off, but I couldn't figure out what it was, so I just kept watching TV with my cousin. The uneasy feeling didn't go away, so I got up and went to lock the back door. When I came back through the kitchen, I saw what was making me feel so strange. In the window, there was an old, rough-looking man, staring inside at my cousin. My instincts kicked in. I acted like I didn't notice the guy and told my cousin we should go upstairs since our parents would be home soon, and they wouldn't want him staying up late. So, I went upstairs and put him to bed, fully aware that there was a man outside who wanted to get in. At the time, I was about 130 pounds and 5 feet 7 inches, and I played football for my school. If I recall correctly, I went back downstairs to the kitchen and grabbed a meat tenderizing hammer. When I turned back to the window, he wasn't there anymore. I rushed to the front door and made sure both the deadbolt and the knob were locked. Then, I hurried back upstairs with the meat tenderizer and went into my cousin's room, sitting down in front of the door. He asked what I was doing, and I told him not to worry and to keep his head down. I called the police and then my dad and uncle. The police said they'd take about 30 minutes, and my dad and uncle were 40 minutes away. That's when I heard a window shatter and the sound of heavy boots walking around downstairs. I told my cousin to stay calm, hide under the covers, and keep quiet. I could hear the guy moving around on the main floor. It was terrifying. I gripped that meat tenderizer and waited. About 5 minutes later, I heard the boots coming up the stairs. At this point, my heart was racing. My cousin's door was only about 10 feet from the stairs. I heard him open the doors to my aunt and uncle's room, then the bathroom. Then he went back downstairs, and I heard him open the basement door. About 15 minutes later, the police arrived and stormed into the house. It turned out the man had escaped from a mental institution in a neighboring state. I was staying at my grandmother's house for the weekend. It was an old, creaky place on a quiet street where everyone kept to themselves. She loved the calm, but it always made me feel uneasy. The house had a way of making you feel like you were being watched, even when you were alone. On Saturday evening, it started. My grandmother had gone to bed early as usual, leaving me downstairs to watch TV. I sat on the couch with the only light coming from the flickering screen. The house was eerily quiet except for the occasional groan of the old floorboards. As the hours passed, I began to feel more and more uneasy. Something felt off. The usual background noises, the ticking clock and the hum of the fridge, sounded distant, like they were being muffled by something else, something more frightening. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible creak coming from the kitchen. I froze, my eyes darting to the dark doorway that led to the kitchen. The sound was faint, but it made my skin crawl. I stayed still, listening, my heart racing. A few seconds later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, like someone was carefully stepping on the floorboards, testing each step. I didn't want to believe it, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was in the kitchen. My mind tried to reason it away, thinking it was just the house settling. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps were too deliberate, too human. I sat there, paralyzed with fear, as the sound grew closer. Whoever it was, they were coming towards the living room. I couldn't stay there any longer. I quietly slipped off the couch, trying not to make a sound, and crept towards the stairs. My only thought was getting to my grandmother. She was old and fragile. If there was someone in the house, she wouldn't be able to defend herself. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard the footsteps stop. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare look back. Instead, I raced up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, my feet barely touching the steps. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. When I reached the top, I glanced over my shoulder. The doorway at the bottom of the stairs was empty, but that didn't ease my fear. I knew someone was still downstairs, and they knew I was up here. I rushed to my grandmother's room and found her asleep, unaware of the danger. I gently shook her, but she didn't wake. She was on medication that made her sleep deeply, so waking her up was impossible. I stood there, torn between staying with her or hiding somewhere else. Then, I heard the creaking again, this time on the stairs. They were coming up. I couldn't think straight. My body moved on its own as I slipped into the closet, pulling the door just slightly open to see through the crack. I crouched there, barely breathing, as the footsteps drew nearer. The creaking stopped outside the room. I could see a shadow under the door, long and still. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening. I prayed they wouldn't come in, that they'd leave, but the door handle slowly turned. The door opened with a soft click, and I held my breath. I could only see their feet, worn, dirty boots, standing in the doorway. The figure didn't move, just stood there, as if deciding what to do next. After what felt like hours, the figure finally stepped into the room. I watched as they moved slowly, cautiously, towards my grandmother's bed. I wanted to scream, to do something, but I couldn't make a sound. I could only watch in horror as they stood over her. But they didn't do anything. They just stood there watching her sleep. I could see the outline of their body, but it was too dark to make out any details. Then, as quietly as they had come in, they turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind them. I stayed hidden for what felt like forever, too scared to move. When I was finally sure they were gone, I crept out of the closet and checked on my grandmother. She was still asleep, unaware of the intruder. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the door, listening for any sign that they had returned. But the house was silent. The next morning, I called the police. They didn't find anything, no forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. They said it was probably just my imagination. But I knew what I heard. Someone had been in the house. For the rest of the weekend, I stayed by my grandmother's side, never letting her out of my sight. But the feeling of being watched never left. Even now, when I think back to that night, I can't shake the image of those boots standing by her bed. The thought that someone was watching her sleep, that they were so close, makes my skin crawl. The worst part is not knowing why they were there or if they might come back. And now, every time I'm alone in the dark, I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. I was the only one who saw the start of it all. We live in a house out in the country, far from any neighbors. It was a hot summer night, and we didn't have air conditioning upstairs, so all the windows were open. My window was right above the sliding door leading to our deck. It was around 1 a.m. when our dogs started barking. I didn't think much of it at first since they usually barked at animals outside. But they calmed down quickly, which was unusual. Then, I heard it, a soft, barely noticeable knocking. I froze, terrified. I knew I was the only one awake and had to see what was causing it, but I didn't want to. Then came another faint knock. I knew I had no choice, so I looked down and saw a man. A very tall, strong man wearing a trench coat. He wasn't knocking with his hand, but with something he was holding. I quietly made my way to my mom's room to wake her up, and then to my dad's room. My parents sleep in different rooms due to their differing sleep patterns, but they're happy together, so don't judge. It was difficult to wake him since he sleeps deeply, but I didn't want to make any noise that would alert the man outside. My dad's room is also near the deck, so he looked out and saw the man. Now, the man was shaking the door handle, trying to get in quietly but forcefully. Dad grabbed something to protect himself. We all headed downstairs, with Mom and me following closely behind him. When the man saw us ready to defend ourselves, he stepped back, looking surprised. Dad spoke to him through the window, asking why he was there, what he wanted, and saying he had a weapon and had already called the police. The man started stammering, pretending to be drunk and claiming he needed a ride home. My dad replied with a line I'll never forget, because it was so spot on. I don't buy it. Who wears a trench coat in the middle of summer if they're just drunk? The man saw the police car arriving and bolted across the field. They later found a machete near the deck. One of the most terrifying experiences I had while being home alone happened during one of the first times I was left by myself as a teenager. I was home alone on a random Saturday when my parents took my sister to some event. I was enjoying the freedom, and everything was going smoothly until I decided to leave the house to visit a friend. My parents had specifically told me not to go out, but I didn't listen. In the moment, I left without locking the door, completely forgetting about it. I returned a few hours later with a terrible gut feeling. Something felt off, and I noticed that cabinets were open and things were scattered around the house. I began to panic but didn't fully believe someone was inside because everything was so quiet. I started shouting around the house to see if anyone was there, but there was no response. I started to feel a bit more at ease until my phone rang. The caller ID was unknown. Out of curiosity, I answered, only to hear deep, heavy breathing on the other end. Fear gripped me. It felt like something straight out of a horror movie. I kept asking, "Who is this?" repeatedly, but the call ended abruptly. 2 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was the same unknown number, and once more I heard the deep breathing. This time it sounded angrier. Frustration and fear mixed as I demanded they speak, but the call ended again. I received another call from the same unknown number. The breathing resumed, but then, out of nowhere, a deep, quiet voice whispered, "I'm inside the house." My heart nearly stopped, and chills ran down my spine. I had never been so terrified in my life. But trying to keep calm, I convinced myself it was just a prank call from my friend or maybe my sister, knowing I was home alone. The caller hung up again, but then I heard creaking from upstairs, followed by loud footsteps. Something fell, and I realized someone was sprinting down the stairs. I managed to get a head start and bolted out of the house, disappearing into the woods nearby. I immediately called the police. When the cops arrived, they found the door wide open, but they never found the person who had broken in. I'm just thankful I can share that terrifying story today. This happened over 20 years ago, and I still remember it clearly. I was around 16 at the time. After finishing a late shift at a store, I planned to meet a friend at his place. My friend lived in a trailer on his family's farm, and he had 2 roommates. The place was known for being a party spot. Every weekend, we could blast music, make noise, and have fun without anyone stopping us. His trailer was about 200 yards off a quiet country road, surrounded by trees. When I arrived, no one was home because they were all coming back from a racing event, so I decided to wait for them. I sat on the couch, which was against a wall with a window above it facing the woods. I was facing the TV, and there was another window above it also looking out at the woods. There was only a dirt road in front of the house that led to and from the trailer. I turned on the TV and started watching the late-night news. I thought I heard a knock from the corner of the room above my head. I ignored it at first, but then I heard another knock a few moments later. That got my attention. A few minutes later, I heard 3 clear knocks from the same corner of the room. It sounded like it was coming from outside, but I couldn't be sure. The knocking continued, 3 knocks every couple of minutes, for about half an hour. I was so terrified that I couldn't move. My heart was pounding in my chest. This was before cell phones and all the gadgets we have today. I was alone in the woods with nowhere to go and no one to call for help. Finally, I gathered the courage to get up, run out the front door, jump in my car, and drive away as fast as I could. The next day, I told my friend and his roommates what had happened. To my shock, they said they had experienced the same thing before. They had been at home, just hanging out since it was a work night, and they heard the same knocking. At first, they thought someone was outside the house playing a prank. They both rushed out, one through the front door and the other through a side door, to catch whoever was messing with them, but they found no one. This wasn't the only strange thing that happened at that place, but this was my personal experience.